I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Afghanistan and a recent UN report that is speaking about the unprecedented number of civilians that have been killed or wounded in Afghanistan from just July to September of this year, i.e. 2019. The UN report then goes on to call this violence totally unacceptable. As if on cue, multiple blasts tore through a mosque during Friday prayers this Friday itself in Afghanistan, killing at least 62 people as of this recording and injuring hundreds in Nangarhar province. Who is to blame then for all this violence? The UN report talks about anti-government groups. I believe it says around 62% of all the casualties came because of anti-government fighters, though it says casualties caused by pro-government forces also rose 26%. That is according to the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan. Let's discuss all of this a bit further, of course, in the context of the so far stalled peace process. Remember that the U.S. and the Taliban seemingly had come very close to signing some sort of a peace understanding or agreement. Let's introduce our panelists who are joining us to discuss all of this a bit further. We're joined from Washington, D.C. by Mr. Marvin Weinbaum, who is Director of Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at the Middle East Institute. We're also joined by Victoria Fontan, who is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies, Dean of Faculty and Associate Provost at the American University of Afghanistan. She's joining us now from Kabul. Victoria and Marvin, thank you both for your time today. Marvin, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of these increasing civilian casualties in 2019 after all these years of the U.S.-led coalition being involved in that country? Why are we seeing rising civilian casualties?
Oh, it may very well be that this is an anomalous situation because we just have the combination of the elections and the peace negotiations. And I think both of them contributed to the increase in the level of violence. The elections, because elections always raise the tension in the country. And there are a number of the much that happened was associated with the elections. But really, it's probably actually and ironically, this effort to reach some kind of agreement where both sides were upping their efforts here for presumably bargaining position in this negotiations. So I think we have to credit what has happened to these two factors. On the other hand, it's at the same time possible that it's just the character of the elections, which on the American side at least is so dependent on air power.
Yeah.
And the Taliban, of course, take advantage of opportunities, and any one major attack like the 62 who were killed in the mosque will raise that figure considerably.
Okay, so Victoria, what are your thoughts? You're on the ground there. I wonder what your thoughts are about what's behind the surge in violence from July to September this year. Is it down to the elections? Is it down to this quote-unquote peace process? And as Marvin there said, essentially grandstanding on the part of the Taliban too, trying to send a message essentially to the opposing side?
Well, I think that before responding to your question, it's important to introduce a larger context. In the first 6 months of 2019, the majority of casualties were actually caused by pro-government forces. So pro-government and anti-government forces are sharing, let's say, this grim figure. For the first 6 months, it was NATO and it was government forces in Afghanistan. And then since July, it's the Taliban. So I think that if we place this within a larger context, we see that both parties in this ceasefire negotiation are actually responsible for this upsurge in violence. And what's very important here is to mention that it was never a peace negotiation. It was a ceasefire negotiation. And in order to keep one's leverage when negotiating a ceasefire, one needs to keep the violence at its highest, because otherwise why is it worthwhile to negotiate if there is no violence at all? So both parties are equally responsible. And I do concur with Marvin. I think that the combination between both the negotiation and the elections is let's say, behind this upsurge in violence in 2019.
So then, Marvin, this is quite a dangerous game then, right? The pawns in the middle of this tug of war, if I may call it that, from both sides, is the Afghan people and their innocent lives. I mean, that doesn't bode well for any, be it ceasefire or even peace in the future?
Well, there was no ceasefire. To me, the negotiations were an American exit agreement. I don't think, and we, of course, recognize that no ceasefire agreement was ever reached, aside from the fact that the Taliban said, we won't shoot at you as you leave. So I think that obviously a ceasefire was the critical element here to demonstrate that there was progress. We never saw it, nor did we ever see anything begin which would suggest that the intra-Afghan discussions were going to lead to some agreement on the character of a new state. So I really do think we have to talk about this as simply a departure agreement in which the United States would have the cover to be able to leave without an embarrassing departure.
Okay, but then I imagine, again, Victoria, going back to the Afghan people, this is not winning favor for either side with the people. Then what does this mean for those people, again, as I put to Marvin, caught in the middle of all this?
Well, what it means is that the number of casualties has reached about 10 casualties a day. It means that the students that come to my university every day don't know if they're going to either arrive alive or get home alive. And the population is very aware, acutely aware of this tug of war that is taking place between both pro-government forces and anti-government forces. And I would say that in a way, even though the daily situation is terribly difficult for them, there is a hope for peace coming from civil society and coming from organizations that know that they cannot leave the government or the United States or the Taliban to negotiate this peace, because they are never going to succeed within the current circumstances. So I would say that the appetite for peace on the ground is even greater because of this situation than it has been for the past 40 years.
Okay, so then Marvin, obviously, I mean, it makes certainly that for the Afghan people who have been suffering for such a long time that they would obviously want peace. And as Victoria there described, certainly I imagine that for many students of hers who come to university, they're just worried about, daily life and their personal safety and their family members' safety. But I wonder, can the Taliban be trusted, for example? I mean, that's a question that has come up a number of times, right? Because they have a lot of blood on their hands. Can a group like that be trusted to just form a government and be part of a government, even if they, for example, now call them ex-Taliban members, or they're not then called Taliban, or even really the American side, or even the Kabul government side? I mean, everyone's hands have blood on them in this situation. Who can the Afghan people actually trust?
Well, I think I agree with Victoria that all of us want to see peace. This has been going on. Really, there have been 6 civil wars ever since 1978. This has been continuous conflict across this entire time. So everyone is desperate, really, for some kind of peace. But what kind of peace means? Is it going to be a constitutional democratic system, or is it going to be an emirate? I think this is the crucial problem, that the Taliban, through it all, and they talk about sharing power, but they really want to share power under an emirate. And for that means is you can be part of the process, you can remain, but this will be a government which is governed as we determine the Sharia dictates it. That's, I think, at the heart of it. And there's no indication that the Taliban have ever given, that they would compromise on a kind of system in which they would have to compete for power, in which they would have to, I think, be subject to popular will.
And that's a very good point, Victoria, because, as you well know, Victoria, the argument made sometimes, and quite often, in fact, I should say sometimes, is that Kabul itself is almost like a bubble, and the government in Kabul is almost functioning within a bubble existence where it doesn't have as much power throughout the country. And in fact, the Taliban's influence and power possibly is rising quite significantly in other parts of the country. What does this then mean for democracy, quote unquote, in Afghanistan? Because certainly the Taliban would have very different views, certainly from the likes of Ashraf Ghani or somebody else in the Afghan government about what democracy and democratic ideals would be?
Well, I guess that people here are not so much talking about democracy as they are talking about their constitutional rights and the necessity to keep the advances that have been made since the 2004 constitution. And this is something very clear both in Kabul and outside of Kabul. I would say that you're absolutely right. There is a Kabul elite that is completely against negotiating anything with the Taliban. But then there are other elements within the country and also within Kabul that recognize that Afghanistan is a pluralistic society, and that some of the support that the Taliban are benefiting from in other parts of the country is also what constitutes Afghanistan. And I think that those people that can establish a middle ground between the hardliners on both sides can actually put or bring the constitution forward and say, we've made those advances, how can we actually keep them? And for me, the constitution, more than democratic ideals, the constitution is at the core of the negotiation of what Afghanistan is going to be after this conflict.
Very well. We'll leave there as a word, but of course we appreciate both Victoria and Marvin for their time today and of course for their insight, putting this all into context for myself and our viewers. Viewers, we were talking there about the UN report, the UNAMA report, the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan, saying in this report specifically that from July to September of this year, that anti-government forces were responsible for about 62% of casualties in Afghanistan. But as Victoria there correctly pointed out as well in her answer, an earlier answer, is that in the first 6 months of the year, in fact, it was pro-government forces that were responsible for more civilian casualties. And that was one of the first times that this happened in this long-standing war and situation there in that country, ever since especially the US-led coalition got involved after 9/11. In the middle of all this, as I put to both of our guests, are the Afghan people. Are they benefiting from the democracy, quote unquote, that has been brought in just within Kabul and certain other districts possibly across the country? Will they benefit from a Taliban resurgence? At the end of the day, everybody has blood on their hands. Going forward, though, how does one resolve the situation? Will a deal with the U.S. ever really happen? With the U.S., I mean, and the Taliban, of course, be it a ceasefire, as Victoria said, or later on, a proper peace agreement, possibly with the Kabul government itself. A lot of questions remain to be answered, of course. We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still with me, Waqar Rizvi, and we're still watching Scope. In this segment, we're going to discuss the U.S. imposing tariffs on the European Union. That has now gone through seemingly, even though last-minute talks did not seemingly were not able to, stop the situation from going through. As we had spoken about last week as well, the U.S. had spoken about this issue of Airbus specifically versus Boeing, and saying that Airbus was getting unfair subsidies from the respective governments involved in the parts that go into making those Airbus planes. That's not the only issue, of course, on the table. There are other companies as well that will be affected. Upwards of $7.5 billion worth of tariffs now on European goods will be placed by the United States. Europe has warned that it may very well retaliate, even though the German finance minister is in Washington, D.C., seemingly trying to scramble negotiations to try to prevent the imposition of these tariffs at this time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Ron Keller, who is a former Dutch ambassador. He's also former top advisor at the EU and the Dutch Ministries of Finance and Foreign Affairs. He's joining us now from The Hague. Joining us from Stockholm is Glen Hodgson, who is a founder and CEO of Free Trade Europa, which promotes free trade, openness, and personal choice. Glen and Ron, thank you both for your time today. Ron, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the imposition of these tariffs? It was a legitimate point, was it not, on the issue of subsidies given to Airbus?
Yeah, thank you, Waqar. I think the ruling after about 15 years of procedures in the World Trade Organization is there. And the ruling is made in accordance with the rules that we agreed as international community on trade. And it allows the United States to impose a kind of a similar amount of tariffs for which Airbus is convicted of being subsidized over the last decades. It allows the U.S. to do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be implemented, of course, those tariff sanctions. The U.S. chose to do so, and that fits into the overall policies of the Trump administration to renegotiate trade arrangements, to toughen their stance on global relations and trade, be a bit more protectionistic and isolationistic, and that is all bad news for the world economy and for the U.S. economy included. So this is, yes, it was to be expected after 15 years, a ruling. Yeah. The timing is unfortunate. It coincides with the worsening of international trade relations.
Okay, so Glen, what are your thoughts on this? Because I imagine this argument can go both ways, right? The U.S. can say, listen, international norms and these rules at the WTO were put in place for a reason, as Ron there alluded to as well. So it won the case, and so it's putting in these tariffs. I mean, it's sort of just cause and effect, isn't it? Why then would EU have a problem with this?
I think one of the big reasons within this moment is, as we were hearing just now, the global economy is sadly going into a very tricky period. And I think that, the last thing we need is another trade war, a trade war being opened up on another front. We're already seeing the effects of the US-China disputes. And now, of course, we're bringing sort of Europe into it. And I think that it's enlightened self-interest. President Trump is a smart guy, and he realizes that he needs to get elected again next year. And with the sort of the softening signs in the U.S. economy, history clearly shows that no sitting U.S. president has ever been reelected when the U.S. economy has been going into a recession. I think also there's the similar issue here. We see that there is a case open against Boeing as well. We're probably going to see the result of that in the new year. And basically, this is a tit-for-tat trade spat. And at the end of the day, it looks like the WTO is going to rule against Boeing as well. And it's just very sad to see that the U.S. administration will not try and come to a deal now, but will try and put in place these tariffs, get the money, and then probably look to some kind of deal once the WTO ruling comes through against Boeing in the new year. We could save a lot of time and a lot of effort, and basically from the European and the global economy, as well as the U.S. economy, that is being hurt by this ongoing death by 1,000 cuts.
Indeed, and Ron, a lot of people think that small businesses especially, and those that sell French wine, Italian cheese, Scottish whiskey, etc., that they will be hurt the most in this trade war between the EU and the US, at least on the EU side, I'm saying. Do you think that this is more politics than actually just about trade? Because that's an argument made by many people as well, that the Europeans and the Americans now actually disagree on many political issues as well, and that America is almost acting out against Europe for that reason?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. Let me first say that these measures are, and I agree very much with Glen. These measures do not only about wine and about olive oil. It fits into the wider picture. Bear in mind that earlier the U.S. has imposed sanctions on steel and aluminium. Likewise, some European countries, notably France, and I think Britain is to follow, have imposed a so-called digital services sector tariff. So you see that there is indeed a wider issue at stake. There could be, the US has been threatening with that, there could be in the future an increase in tariffs on cars, car import, very important for the European economy and for the German economy in particular. So it fits into a wider picture, and not only small and medium-sized enterprises are affected, it really affects the whole of our economies at a time that we don't need it. Actually, we are already faced with a downturn, as Glen just mentioned. Does it fit into a wider picture of a divergence between the United States and Europe? I think firmly yes. I think it's fair to say that since, let's say, roughly the Cold War, during the Cold War period, U.S. and European geopolitical interests have more or less overlapped. After the fall of the wall, Europe has come into a completely different geopolitical situation. We are not good in formulating our own interests in that respect. We still struggle to get to a united foreign policy and strategic thinking, but it is clear that Europe is rethinking its own position. The United States has to get used to that and has to accept that, but find it hard to accept these realities. So it fits indeed into the wider picture of the worsening of the relationship between Europe and the US at the time, I say, when all of the countries and nations together, including China, Russia, and other parts of the world, need to team up firmly for global challenges like climate and other issues.
All right, so then, Glen, it's actually more politics than actually just about trade, as I'd put to Ron, because again, if that is the case, and obviously we can list a number of political issues that the European bloc and the Americans would disagree on, and I can pick up, the Iran nuclear deal, for example, and I'm sure there are other issues, be it climate change as well, the Paris Climate Accord. There are some key issues as well that these two sides disagree on. Is it more really about the politics than actually just a case about Airbus versus Boeing, for example?
Yeah, I definitely think it's really the case of what we're looking at now is politics, and this is what's coming into it as well. I mean, I think that the way this is being sort of pulled out as well at the moment, whereby we're getting sectors that are completely blameless being brought into it, whether it's Italian olive oil, Scotch whiskey, French wines. That are being hit by this, and it's going to cost jobs. It's going to cost a lot of political badwill as well. And I think that as we were just hearing now, absolutely, we're hearing this, seeing this sort of schism, and almost in a global setting, we're seeing sort of the US going off in one direction, we're seeing China going off in another direction, and Europe sort of trying to sort of do this balancing act where it sort of keeps everyone happy. But I think what we're definitely going to see is a separate path. And I think we're going to see this existing relationships and forging a new future is something that's going to be tested more and more, not just now, but into the future when we're talking about sort of competition, industrial policy, how we deal with technology, the environment. This is just sort of the start of an ongoing process. We're going to see more and more of that as we go into the future. But at the end of the day, we really need to have sort of working together to address global problems. And sadly, this is something that we're forgetting at the moment. The economy will suffer. The environment will suffer. And instead of fighting each other, there should be more of an effort to work together, as we see now with the sort of the global rules-based trading system, which is really under threat.
Indeed. So, Ron, I wonder, do you think Europe will, I don't want to put it this way, but stand up for itself in the sense that, do you think Europe will hit back? Because there are calls, I believe, from German officials saying, let's remain calm, let's not right now immediately retaliate, even though Cecilia Malmström herself did say that the bloc would have no alternative but to impose its own countermeasures. I believe it was a German finance minister himself who said, let's remain calm right now and let's not do anything. Because, I mean, I imagine at some level, Ron, if the EU doesn't do anything, then it almost comes off as a bit weak, doesn't it?
Yeah, the temptation is there to hit back and to retaliate. And I think some political statements have been made to that effect. I truly hope that our politicians are more wise than those who impose protectionist tariffs. and that we will realize that we're not only talking about retaliation towards the other side, but imposing tariffs is also hurting your own economy. To give you an example, I mean, at present, the average United States family household is already paying annually $600 and more on extra costs, expenditures, basically purchasing power wasted on tariff measures by their own U.S. administration. So taking retaliation sounds tough, but it's shooting in your own foot. I hope our leaders will come together, realize that protectionism and tariff measures are always lose-lose situations. There's no winners. No economic theory will prescribe that trade restrictions are to be advised. It requires leadership now to stay calm and firm and to tell the Americans that this is not good for them and not good for us and not good for the world economy.
Very well, Ron. We'll leave that as our final word. But of course, we appreciate yourself and Glen for your time and, of course, your insight today and putting this all into context for us. Viewers, we're talking about, of course, the U.S. deciding to go through with those tariffs on the EU, $7.5 billion worth of tariffs, by the way. And that, of course, stemming from a long-standing case, as one of our guests there said, 15 years, I believe, against Airbus for being subsidized by some specific countries, including France, Germany, and others who are involved in building Airbus planes. There is such a case, mind you, also against Boeing for also being subsidized by the U.S. government. And that case is likely to also be won at the WTO by the EU side. So we're going to see this tit-for-tat measures unless talks are able to be successful in stalling all of these measures from going through. But as our guest there said, consumers on both sides of the ocean will be hurt significantly through this, and not just small businesses, but even on major issues also. And then, of course, the major issue, political issues, are also ones that need to be discussed. The Iran nuclear deal, as I'd put to one of our guests, and climate change, the Paris Climate Accord, et cetera, et cetera. There are many issues which now EU and the Americans clearly disagree on. Can those gaps be bridged between these two major trading blocs and sides? We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a Guardian investigation into a conference that took place in August in the United States, held by the American Legislative Exchange Council, known as ALEC. The meeting at ALEC was disclosed in emails obtained under Freedom of Information request. And now those emails show that Republican state lawmakers joined pro-Israeli lobbyists in Texas to discuss disseminating new restrictions on speech relating to Israel on campuses across the United States, essentially. And of course, this is not a new issue. I mean, there has been a clampdown, seemingly, on pro-Palestine / voices that are critical of Israeli policies throughout the occupied territories. And this has been something that's been happening for a number of years now. A number of professors, and I could probably name quite a few of them, such as Norman Finkelstein and others, who have even lost tenures and or been punished in some way or the other by their respective universities and institutions for daring to criticize Israel in any fashion. So then what of free speech then? Why can't this free exchange of ideas about Israeli policies happen in an open and transparent fashion? No one is saying that the other side shouldn't have the right to do so. So why stop pro-Palestine voices from being able to have their say as well? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Omar Zahzah, who is a part of the Students for Justice in Palestine, the SJP, is also a member of the Graduate Students for Justice in Palestine at UCLA, and is also a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement, the PYM. He is joining us now from Los Angeles. Omar, thank you for your time this morning. What do you make of this investigation? Certainly it's not new, as I put to our viewers, and your organization, specifically the SJP, is actually mentioned in quite detail, and it's been targeted a number of times by those who really want to clamp down on free speech about Israel. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Actually, my initial impression, was exactly as you're describing. It's nothing new. Having had the opportunity to be in, organizations such as SJP for years while I was in graduate school, as well as the other affiliated Palestine organizations, what I realized was this is actually a very tired iteration of the same strategy, which is to continue to find new ways to clamp down on speech related to Palestine under the guise, right, of racism, of anti-Semitism. So basically to put an embargo upon, political commentary, political analysis, political activism by claiming that it is consummate, with basically a form of racism, of discrimination. And so, what I would say is basically for me at this point, really it's gotten to the point where I no longer look at the particular manifestations of the strategy, but rather try to think of the strategy, principally in its whole, right? Okay. Which suggests that there is something about trying to advocate for Palestine itself, which is so, for whatever reason, controversial, right, to establishment interests, to the protection of power, that basically allowing the traditional avenues of exchange of speech, political activism, so on and so forth, become detrimental, to those who are interested in upholding the status quo, right? And the thing is, we can understand why administrators would be interested in banning racism or banning so on and so forth from at public avenues. But the thing is, I can say this directly as somebody who's been an activist in this cause for many years. Every single time we've seen such an initiative come up, it is principally about Palestine. It has nothing to do with other marginalized students, right, on campuses. 2016, the UC Regents attempted basically to ban anti-Zionism on campus, by introducing what they called a statement of principles against intolerance. Now, this supposedly was unveiled after, a substantial amount of time of research. But what we found was
if I may comment, Omar, because I think it's important that anti-Zionism point, because that's something that's brought up a lot, especially these days, as you well know, where they're trying to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and just put an equal sign in between both of those. Is that fair?
Yes. I mean, it's fair to say that that's the strategy. Now, obviously anti-Zionism has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, is, right, the basically prejudice, the racism, against people for ethno-religious identity. Anti-Zionism is a principled anti-racist position, which is about rejecting, the ideology that supports the state of Israel, that supports the continued, right, military occupation of Palestine, the colonization of Palestine, so on and so forth. So exactly this is what's going on. You have the strategy, which is the attempt to conflate the two, and through this conflation to say that there is a rising tide, basically, of anti-Semitism on campuses. Now, that's not to say that there's not a rising tide of anti-Semitism in the U.S. The latter is very much true. But, right, the issue is that, speech on Palestine is not a manifestation of that other phenomenon, which really what we're seeing, with the resurgence of white nationalism, via Trump, so on and so forth, right? So it's really important to be able to distinguish between racism and political speech, that this is precisely what Zionists in the United States are trying to abolish the ability to do, right? And that's the other thing that doesn't really get talked about that much, is you have sort of what you might call the concerned middle, right? Those who are very concerned about anti-racism, so on and so forth, who don't know these nuances, right? They're the ones who get swept up by the strategy. It's not those of us who actually do this work, right? It's not those of us who even may be very staunch Zionists who believe in this thing, right? Because those of us, we're fixed, basically. But what happens when these strategies are widely disseminated is it sweeps up a larger majority of individuals who really don't know the distinction, and, under good intentions, whatever it may be, they take up this mantle, right? Not realizing that this is what's happening.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the higher profile figures who have, been advised for speaking out for Palestine. We can talk about Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and we can talk about Zahra Billu as well of Keller, who was recently removed from the Women's March as well, from the executive board there. And I mean, obviously there's a much longer list of professors and others who have also been targeted in some way or the other. But do you think that the fact that those sorts of examples are growing, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, that's a very recent example that I'm talking about. Do you think that that's almost showing a slowly changing tide, even within the U.S. vis-a-vis discussions about Israel?
Yes, definitely. I think there is a changing tide in terms of, the discussions around Palestine. And I personally noticed this, on campus at UCLA, where I've worked for several years, even just among the student body. There's been a sizable shift in terms of what individuals think about Palestine or say about Palestine, right? Which only a few years prior was relatively unprecedented. And as you mentioned, Glen, Omar, all of these things, that coming into the public landscape, I think really was unthinkable just a few years ago. So, I think what's happening is a very interesting kind of paradox, right? On the one hand, you have this growing awareness of what's happening with Palestine, this kind of growing nakedness of public consensus, which is, okay, we really have to acknowledge that whether or not we use the terms of activists, okay, that this is colonialism at the same time, realizing that there is something, unbalanced basically about the dynamic at the very least.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, the material situation in Palestine itself not getting any better. So on the one hand, this growing public consensus, not necessarily coinciding with material change in Palestine, but at the very least reflecting the fact, right, that there is something at issue. And I think that this is something to really take note of and something even to cautiously celebrate.
All right. Omar, we'll leave it there at that. And of course, we appreciate your time this morning, putting that all into context for us as Omar Zahzah speaking to us from Los Angeles. He's part of many groups such as Students for Justice in Palestine, Graduate Students for Justice in Palestine at UCLA, and the Palestinian Youth Movement as well. All of those groups, of course, doing work, criticizing Israel and keeping transparency on the issue of Israel. And of course, this is an important issue because, again, within the U.S. and within much of the Western world, in fact, I would argue, free speech about Israel seems to be a red line. That's the one no-go area if you want your job to be secure, be it in media, be it on universities, be it as an academic or otherwise. You simply cannot criticize Israel without any blowback and any criticism and just immediate allegations of anti-Semitism. This has happened to many people, of course. Even Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who are congresswomen, have been targeted in this regard also. So certainly this report coming out about this meeting of Republican state lawmakers wanting to further put in place rules to stop any criticism of Israel on university campuses, which by definition should be places where free speech and free flow of ideas should be allowed, is certainly disturbing. We'll keep an eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.